We probably shouldn't be surprised that Andor, now concluded over on Disney+, hasn't brought in a huge viewership. But we probably should be sorry about that. Only part of the blame for it lies with the show itself. Fans who've been crying out for a return to more intelligent storytelling, for writers to demonstrate they know and care about the IPs they steward, and for studios to treat these like more than mere properties and merchandising opportunities, well, we couldn't have really asked much more of Andor. The sad fact is that after far too many years and far too many entries into Disney's Star Wars canon, a great many people couldn't be bothered to ask questions of the show in the first place. Of course, Andor isn't perfect in its own right, and it is probably worth getting some of the faults out of the way first because, unusually, there's actually less to say on that account. Also because I'm so used to critiquing bullshit that I need to warm up the other muscles before I try an extended period of praise. Of the show's own faults, the biggest has to be its pacing. The cheap and easy remark to make would be that we now live in a world of streaming services and binge watching, and so the weekly release model just doesn't sit naturally with the audience anymore, but that would be too cheap and too easy. We have not in fact witnessed the death of serialization. House of the Dragon, on which another praise video will release in due course, proves that an audience will wait, and will wait happily, for weekly installments, provided they are given a reason to. But writing a serialized show requires a different understanding of pace and the deployment of events than writing for a binge-watching audience. Andor's principal problem here is that it is a weekly show paced for a binge-watching audience. The idea was, evidently, to structure the season in 3-episode arcs. Unfortunately, that often meant that in at least one of every 3 episodes, next to nothing actually happened, often the middle episode of the 3-episode arc. Perhaps due to proximity, the one that comes most readily to mind is the penultimate episode of the entire season, which was evidently designed to lower the tempo between the prison escape of episode 10 and the finale of episode 12, but which lowered it so much that it barely had a pulse. In it, we learned that Andor's mother had died, and as far as I can recall, we didn't learn very much else. When 1 in 3 episodes sees its pulse drop almost to the point of death, you can see why an audience that's been conditioned for impatience would not stick with the show. But it's not just people who crave action who find themselves bored and frustrated. It's a general audience too, people unsure about whether to invest their time in the show, and those who've been so used to Disney-era bullshit non-entertainment that they bring in no pre-existing investment. I liked what Andor was trying to do, and I liked it from the start, but even I found myself waiting until 2 or 3 episodes had released before catching up on events, because that felt like the most natural way to enjoy the story. It's easier to appreciate what is, in its narrative rhythm, not unlike a musical symphony with its distinct movements if you have it in one go. It has the opening allegro, which is faster and more energetic, a slower second act, the andante, more meditative and ponderous. Sometimes then there's a third act, a minuet or a scherzo, either somber or upping the pace again as the mood demands it, and then it rounds off with the final act, the allegro again, or in the final episode, the rondo, that part that returns to the overall theme, in this case, of rebellion. The ideal symphony is one where its parts stand strong alone, which isn't something that can be said for Andor. But either way, the story of a symphony is best appreciated as a complete entity. Thus is Andor best enjoyed in bulk rather than piecemeal, and from thence comes the greatest frustration. You'd have had to change nothing about the story itself to dispense with its pacing issues. You'd simply have had to change the way it was bundled and presented to the audience. You could, for example, have had 4 longer episodes, each with a completed arc, as opposed to 12 shorter episodes released individually, around a third of which lacked the kind of power required to really stand alone narratively. And that is a great shame, because even those episodes perform vital roles in the story, it's just that a vital role did not necessarily mean that it deserved a dedicated episode. A comparison with House of the Dragon is probably apt, because these shows are a lot more similar than they would appear on their face. House of the Dragon was also serialized, and often went entire episodes, sometimes even multiple episodes, without any action to speak of. But it spread meaning, information, and importance much more skillfully throughout its own symphonic acts. It was a slow series overall, but even its exceptionally slow episodes were given enough to stand alone. I believe its episodes averaged out at around 10 minutes longer than Andor's, but each of them feels so much fuller, and each is therefore much less missable. It benefits immensely from having more pieces in play, and so more interest in those episodes where those pieces are just being moved to set up the next phase of the game. House of the Dragon is, in short, more naturally made for a weekly release. Andor, by contrast, is more interested in conceptual than character narratives. Think the entire arc aboard the Panopticon prison. It's interested in how empires work, how justice is enacted, how oppression is achieved, and how rebellions ferment. It has fewer pieces to move because it doesn't so much want to tell these stories through the eyes of its characters. It wants characters in places experiencing concept instead. So it generates less interest as it moves between its conceptual set pieces. There is not enough character motive for us to be really interested in episodes where all that happens is characters moving around and having the occasional conversation. The answer, then, is that you either do the same amount with less, same story, fewer episodes, or you embrace serialization and you do more with the time that you've been given. I think most of what Andor does is very good. It's clever, it's intelligent, it's thoughtful. It doesn't bow to the studio's want for flashy entertainment. In fact, it's testament to what the show does well that I wish the writers had filled their time with more of it. Having said Andor is more interested in concept than in character, the second criticism that seems to me pretty well unanswerable, even if you can qualify it, is characters, mainly its protagonist. Cassian Andor was never a standout character in Rogue One, and we saw him then in what should have been his peak, in terms of development and personality. Now, in his own dedicated show, he is less even than that already quite blank slate, at times a mere cardboard cutout, an excuse for things to happen around him. He ties the show together narratively, he embodies the awakening of the rebellion that is the show's main theme. Yet in and of himself, he lacks life, he lacks character, and quite often he lacks a realizable motivation. The show did flirt with his motivation in its first episodes, when we got his backstory and his personal mission, which was the hunt for his missing sister. And then, it wasn't. It just kind of disappeared, without very much time to linger on the loss of it. And yet, characters need motive just as all people need purpose. Where they don't have it, the lack of it must be emphasized, because the lack of purpose leads quickly to the search for purpose. See Han Solo, for example, who in much less overall screen time in A New Hope, goes from mercenary cynic to someone who has discovered a meaning greater than money. A character arc that really didn't take more than a few minutes of screen time to establish itself, yet was undeniable and evident to the audience. Andor the show tried to send Cassian on a not dissimilar journey, but it showed much less interest in his personal goal than it showed in what was going on around him. Vacant protagonists are not entirely without merit, however. George Orwell's last book review, on which he was working at the time of his death, was of Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited. He never finished it, which is one of the more understated tragedies of literature, though he did note certain problems emerging from Waugh's use of the first person, and he would not have been the only critic to note that Waugh was not especially interested in his protagonists. Charles Ryder in Brideshead Revisited is someone who watches things happen, and he's someone to whom things happen, but he possesses minimal agency in their happening. This allows us to get a much fuller picture of his world, a much deeper understanding of his friends, his lovers, and his contemporaries, but at the expense of his character rather than arising from it. Andor has a similar Warvian dynamic to it. By far the least interesting aspect of it is the character who lends the show its name. Disinterest in him is compensated for by intense interest in the world around him, which reaps some brilliant rewards, but I cling to the idea that this is not an either-or proposition. You could have done both. In particular, there are ways to more closely tie the events of Andor in with Rogue One that only come if you exploit his character. Why, for example, does he come to so quickly trust and then love Jyn Erso? Could you draw parallels with his younger sister, and also with Bix, who we know will have to either die or disappear before the events of that film? How is he so bitter and loveless until that point? What journey did he go on that left him so cynical and spiritually void? His condition at the beginning of Rogue One is that of the fallen man who is then redeemed by love at the end. A prequel show that was interested in his character would take more interest in how he fell to begin with, yet the Andor show we got preferred to take it as a given that he was already in some sense fallen, and the events it depicted only dragged him lower. So in taking little interest in its protagonist, Andor doesn't ignore his growth entirely, but it does limit it, and the uses to which it might otherwise have been put. Those are, to my mind, the show's two biggest and unanswerable problems. I have heard a few more frequently mentioned, and these don't tend to be entirely wrong, though I would argue they're not right either. We can lump them together under the phrase, "it just doesn't feel like Star Wars." It's a criticism often raised on the live streams over at Mr. Brown Alliance, where I'm often on the panel under the guise of my main channel. Star Wars, or so the argument tends to go, is supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be optimistic. It's supposed to be about high adventure, and Andor has none of these things. The argument is right if your conception of what Star Wars should be is limited to A New Hope and Return of the Jedi. It's debatable whether Empire Strikes Back satisfies the fun criteria, and you can't really apply that label to Attack of the Clones, and especially not to Revenge of the Sith, though they all do meet the high adventure criteria. The argument is wrong, though, because even George Lucas found the label fun too restrictive, hence the darker tone of Empire and the high tragedy of the prequel trilogy. If anything, the worst aspects of both the original and prequel trilogies were his attempts to inject more fun into what were otherwise quite serious stories. One of the subordinate complaints about Andor is that it's too gritty, and everything these days is too gritty. A fun, high adventure would be a welcome break. But I don't think that argument holds up to much scrutiny. As I said in a recent livestream at Mr. Brown Alliance, the problem with Phase 4 of the MCU is precisely that we've had constant high stakes, high adventure, fun storytelling. Any style of storytelling that consists of just 2 or 3 notes inevitably becomes stale. If the ambition for Star Wars is to expand the continuous narrative, you need tonal and mood shifts in order to keep things fresh, and you need it not just within a movie trilogy, but within the universal story outside of that trilogy, in all other installments across all other media. This is one of the things the old expanded universe did very well. It told a wide variety of stories, in a wide variety of styles, in a vast array of settings. Some of them were absurdly local, some of them conformed to the grand narrative of high adventure. The expanded universe encompassed in its various moods and styles the galaxy as it is, rather than trying to force the galaxy into one storytelling trope or idea. Were Andor a feature film, I would agree with the criticism. The feature films should rely heavily on high adventure, if not always upon fun. But Andor isn't a feature film. Andor is the closest thing we've had on screen to an old expanded universe novel. It seems absurd to lament that Disney retconned the old EU, only to then complain when we get a show designed in its style. The advantage of that style, of Andor as a TV series, of Andor as a prequel entity, is that it isn't necessary to watch it to understand subsequent events. If you don't like it, your enjoyment of Star Wars is unaffected, unlike when one of the main cinematic entries bombs. The majority of people who really love the franchise probably have never read a single expanded universe book in their lives, and they didn't need to. Andor is a side quest, it's a side story. As with video games, completionists will complete it, and those who prefer to stick to the main plot will skip it. The fact the main plot has so recently been a disaster, and that we presently don't have a main plot to fall back on, probably does colour people's perception of this particular side quest. Interest in Andor would be higher if people still had the buzz of a successful film franchise and the goodwill that generates. But to say, I am done with Star Wars, or I just hate what Disney did to Luke, is not a criticism of Andor, it's a criticism of what went on around it. It oughtn't to affect your judgment of Andor's own qualities, it's just a reason, and an understandable reason, not to be interested in it to begin with. For the rest, and leading on to our praise section, I'd say Andor not only feels like Star Wars, but it feels more like Star Wars than any entry since, and, not coincidentally, Rogue One. Andor stands out for praise in 2 categories in particular, world building and intelligence. Drawing another Game of Thrones analogy, Andor is to George Lucas much as George R.R. Martin is to Tolkien, where world building is concerned. Martin said of Tolkien that he was interested in what he'd left out. Aragorn's arc ends with his ascension to the throne of Gondor, but Martin was more interested in what happened to Gondor next. What was Aragorn's tax policy? How did he unite the realm politically? Game of Thrones is in other respects the anti-Tolkien, especially in its morality. Andor, by contrast, actually hoves much closer to the themes, ideas, and ideals of the creation on which it's expanding: tyranny, rebellion, and hope. But as with George R.R. Martin, the writers of Andor are not content to leave it with, and then the Empire was formed. They want to know how the Empire was formed in the minds of its peoples, how it interacted with its subjects, how it enforced its rule in the backwaters of the galaxy, how it invited rebellion. It fills in the gaps, it adds mechanical depth to the universe. As I said in a video on my main channel, Andor wants to explore those places and peoples we know must exist in the galaxy, but that have never been depicted on screen. In a sense, it's set about repairing some small part of the world destruction wrought by Disney's abandonment of the expanded universe. And it does this, for the most part, effectively. The private security force of its first episodes, the one that governs Ferrix, Morlana, and other planets in an irrelevant backwater sector of the galaxy, effectively portrays the contractual relationship that tyranny has with localism. The Empire cannot be everywhere, and it has no wish to be everywhere. Every empire in the history of the real world had its capital, it had its cultural and economic centers, and it had outlying regions that the high and mighty simply were not that interested in governing. An empire that consists only of stormtroopers, that is equally powerful everywhere in the galaxy, is not only unbelievable, but it runs against the depiction we get of it in the original trilogy, where the rebels exploit its unguarded systems, hitting the enemy where they aren't. We knew this was how the Empire must operate, but Andor manages to show us how it actually works, filling out not only the Empire as a political entity, but populating it with exactly the right type of people. Low-level, overlooked men and women who held menial jobs under the old system, and who react very differently now that the new order has given them more power. You get a mix of the incompetent Jobsworths, and those like Cyril Khan and Sergeant Musk, who find a fanatical loyalty that expresses itself in different ways, one in idealism, the other in brutish pragmatism. Seeing these lower orders has the effect of empowering the Empire's main forces, largely, if not always and entirely, correcting one of the more irritating tropes of Disney-era Star Wars, which is the moronification of the Empire as a means to keep the heroes alive and the plot progressing. Here, the Empire, when we do see it, is highly competent by comparison to local security. It's cold, clinical, well-managed and organized, it's ruthless and it's ambitious. Stormtroopers go from being the butt of every joke to the elite soldiers they are supposed to be. When Imperial forces take over from local security on Ferrix, they carry a sense of threat and dread without really having to do anything. Their reputation is achieved by comparison, by their iconography, by their comparative discipline and firepower. You know in Andor that when the stormtroopers arrive on Ferrix, Ferrix is now oppressed in a way it wasn't when it was under the nominal control of feckless private security cops. Ferrix witnesses 2 acts of defiance, but only one of them counts as rebellion. In yeeting the private security guys in episode 3, the show teases the existence of an unrealized rebel spirit, but it's only in confronting the Empire in the finale, suffering numerous casualties, not actually winning the battle, that the spirit manifests as something more definite. One part of the show's theme is that tyranny rises when the rebel spirit sleeps, the old adage being that all that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. It's not the only instance of this show's writers proving themselves to be quite philosophically astute, thinkers as opposed to propagandists against modern political conceptions of fashionable fascism. The Empire is further empowered by its own depiction. The Imperial Security Bureau is not portrayed as a bunch of hapless morons. The other aspect of that long-standing problem, by the way, being that it makes the entire galactic setup innately unbelievable, since no empire as incompetent as that portrayed during the Disney era could have survived long enough for the rebellion to form in the first place. Instead, the ISB is depicted as clinical, but also intelligent and adaptive. Andor depicts that innately difficult tightrope that all dictatorial systems try, and most inevitably fail, to cross, in balancing the needs of settled order with a willingness to take on board new ideas, practices, and habits. The ISB is managerial. It's a body of an administrative state. It looks at the numbers and it attempts to read the galaxy through data. But as all such organizations do, it risks being captured by groupthink. The mistake of the managerial state is to assume that data contains both information and truth. The reality is that data provides information, the truth rests in how you interpret the data. Groupthink collapses managerial, technocratic, and dictatorial systems because the mindset relies on orthodoxy and is prejudiced against heterodox interpretation. In the end, what matters is not that you're right, it's that you have the right opinion. It would have been very easy just to depict this, and just depicting this would have been more intelligent than the Empire is dumb approach taken elsewhere in Disney Star Wars. But Andor actually goes one further than that, by showing us the dynamic in play rather than just the result of the dynamic. Dedra Meero is a heterodox thinker, an outsider. She's similar in character to the men around her, being ruthless, cold, calculating, and ambitious, but she's excluded from their clique. Her approach is heterodox. She has to fight against orthodox interpretations and the already formed in-group. Yet, in a stroke of minor genius, the writers chose a man as head of the ISB, Anton Lesser's Major Partagaz, who is suspicious of, but open to, heterodox thought. You see the symptoms of institutional thought. He understands that some things have to happen because the system demands it, not because they are the best things to have happen. But here is a man who wants results as well as reputation, and who is prepared to go against the settled view if doing so presents a good chance of achieving a real and tangible goal. This makes him both more intelligent than your average film villain, but also more threatening, and also more understandable. He's not a boilerplate villain, he's not purely motivated by evil, and he's not an idiot. He is a cold, cynical, calculating, ambitious, but very loyal person. He is the kind of person you would probably quite want as your manager in the real world if your goal was to be the best at your job. This isn't just clever writing by Star Wars standards, this is clever writing by pretty much any standard. Against the argument that the show doesn't feel like Star Wars, I'd say Andor is more respectful of the franchise than anything else we've had in the Disney era, arguably more so even than Rogue One, because its writers want to understand how the galaxy and its worlds actually work. They could have settled for swinging lightsabers around and deploying the old familiar sights, but every Disney show has done that, and they have, without exception, been complete garbage. The Andor writers evidently do care quite deeply about Star Wars. You don't do what they've done. You don't go into such depth. You don't explore these areas and tell this kind of story if you don't give a damn. More evidence of this intelligence aligned with world building is in the prison arc on Narkina 5, though you could also cite this as an example of Andor being a little bit more interested in concept than in tone. It would of course have been easy and familiar to present the Empire as straightforwardly brutal in its treatment of prisoners. In fact, so familiar is that idea that this arc does feel a little bit un-Star Warsy. And this isn't an expansion to the galaxy that was strictly necessary in the way that, for example, the private security system was. It would have been acceptable and on theme to be merely brutal. It would have fit the Empire's known character. And yet the show earns this expansion because of how cleverly it deploys it, because of the ideas it's drawing on and conveying, and because of the story it sets within this arc, probably the strongest of all the season's mini-arcs. The Narkina 5 prison is a panopticon, that prison designed by Jeremy Bentham in the 18th century, the intended effect of which was purely utilitarian: maximize the administration of justice while minimizing the resource required to administer it. One important aspect of which is the reduction in violence, in corporal punishment, as a means of maintaining order. Instead, you create a kind of social justice. Because in the panopticon design, you know you might be being watched at any time, but you never know if you are being watched, inmates begin to self-regulate. Especially with the early deployment of group punishment, you never ever risk deviant behavior in the panopticon, not only because you might be being watched, but because everyone around you fears that you might be being watched. If you do something wrong, they'll all be punished, so everyone has a vested interest in stopping their fellow inmates doing something wrong. Michel Foucault, in Discipline and Punish, described the panopticon inmate as one who is, and I quote, seen, but he does not see. He is the object of information, never a subject in communication. In Andor, each facet of this is made manifest. Collective punishment breeds collective responsibility. The fear of being observed compels social self-regulation. The fear of being overheard keeps everyone silent. Though less brutal than a gulag or a concentration camp, the panopticon is an expression of managerial, technocratic tyranny. And Andor weaves this into its theme of rebellion by accurately observing that any system of justice rooted in social convention is effectively tautological. It exists because you believe in it. You believe in it because it exists. If you doubt the premise of the system itself becomes unstable. A system to control the masses cannot, in fact, control the masses unless the masses believe that it can. Cassian yelling, "Nobody's listening," is Foucault's answer to Jeremy Bentham. So much so that I'd be surprised to learn the writers didn't have exactly this in mind when scripting the episode. The Empire is itself a kind of panopticon. It only exists when the rebel spirit sleeps. The moment it awakes, the Empire cannot hold it. It can fall back on brutality and it can fall back on physical terror, but to beat somebody into submission is to admit defeat. That you are in power, but you are not in control. All this is portrayed most vividly by Andy Serkis, who finally gets to star in a non-shit role in a non-shit Star Wars show, and he makes the most of it. But, and moving away from the show's ideas, the acting generally is never less than solid. Andor benefited from A, not being a big budget prestige show with stellar expectations, and B, being based primarily in England. It opted against pursuing big-name stars or those with a long history in Hollywood and whose frame of reference is Hollywood standards of stardom and success. Instead, it cast a number of experienced actors, often with theatre backgrounds, who carry with them that presence, that ability to control a room just by standing there, that leads to excellent performances from the likes of Rupert Vansittart, Fiona Shaw, Alex Ferns, and Genevieve O'Reilly in particular. A show about oppression and tyranny did not call for bombastic actors and bombastic acting. It needed the kind of subtlety that comes with experience, and particularly stage experience, and that is precisely what it got. Those who don't like the tone of the show are at liberty not to, but that's not any mistake on the part of the showrunners. They accomplished exactly the mood they wished for, and the only one that could have done their story justice. The goal wasn't a happy-go-lucky, plucky band of rebels ending the Empire with a mix of charm, brashness, luck, and bravado. It was misery and destitution, which births a rebellion in desperation and at great cost. You're at liberty not to like that. Not every story type suits everyone in the world, but that was the show's intention, and they achieved it as its result. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the show managed to take a premise that was so ripe for party political exploitation, and it kept it on the level of universal truths, wants, and aspirations. In the Disney era, hearing that a show would depict rising fascism and the desperate struggle to overcome it would lead you to expect yet another tedious anti-Trump tirade by activist writers with the here and now in mind. Yet that is not what Andor gave us. You could read that into the show if that's your inclination, but you could just as easily read the opposite. The Empire in Andor is statist, it's managerial, it betrays all the hallmarks of the left-leaning administrative state. It's utilitarian and economic, it allows and encourages individualism for the select in-group, but the out-group is doomed to collectivism, collective punishment furthering individual ambition. Favored versus unfavored identity groups, speech crimes, thought crimes. It displays all the best and worst tropes of humanity, which are common to fascism of both its left and right-wing varieties. And by sticking to these universals, by taking such a keen interest in concepts rather than parties, by not striving to be fashionable or to preach factional values and talking points, Andor once again recaptured something of the spirit of the original trilogy. It's worth remembering, and I will always advance this against those who claim that Star Wars has always been political, that there is a difference between reading something politically and being preached at by that thing. The Galactic Empire in the original trilogy was used by Ronald Reagan as a metaphor for Soviet communism. At once and the same time, communists and other leftists could and did see in Star Wars themes of anti-imperialism and the rebel spirit that they use as a repudiation of the American empire. A show that allows its audience to disagree on its meaning has avoided the didactic. It is political in the sense that it contains things about which we can be political, but it does not divide its audience into the right and the wrong. It invites us to have these arguments. We can read the show as we wish. We do not have to read it one particular way. Of course, you can have the best ideas in the world, but if you can't tell them properly and keep the audience engaged, you will have failed in your main and most basic objective, telling a story. An interest in themes and ideas over the people and their stories perhaps explained why the series finale managed to feel both triumphant and underwhelming. The show reached its moral point, portrayed that awakening of the rebel spirit in theory, yet in practice it's bringing all its disparate cast back together on Ferrix, including those who by right should never have risked the journey, felt like a reluctant acknowledgement that people probably had to populate the theme. It did land certain payoffs, and it landed them quite well, but it missed others, and in its protagonist it had too little invested for the payoff to really be worthwhile anyway. That is chiefly why Andor's pacing issues are so irksome, because the really brilliant work it does won't be appreciated by as many people as otherwise might have liked it. They turned off in the first 3 episodes. Better pacing, a lead with a character as deep as the concepts the show was interested in, perhaps a dash more humour to lighten the mood occasionally, and we would have had a truly brilliant show. As it is, Andor was, as I said in the title, not perfect, but I maintain it was good enough. Highly intelligent, highly thoughtful, excellent world building, and yeah, some good character work as well. It would be nice to think that good writing, like The Rebellion, rests beneath the franchise surface, that it might be awakening once more. If it is, Andor would be a pretty good start. But this is Disney we're talking about, so that almost certainly means we will never get its like again.